Good morning, good morning. Today's daf is daf Chaf Beis Masechus Avoda Zara. Avoda Zara 22. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson family of Eretz Yisrael, for sponsoring Ula Shiurim as a suchos b'suras Torahs for Am Yisrael. We also thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz. We thank Aaron and Alana Weinberg for sponsoring all the Shurim of the month. And thanks to Hashem for all of his nisim, both revealed and the hidden, for the miracle of Yonatan Shai Weinberg 14 years ago for B'suras Tovas for Am Yisrael, and for Eretz Yisrael and the merit of his speedy arrival of Mashiach. Amen. We also thank Daniel Batsheva Pava for sponsoring all the Shurim of the month of Tammuz in commemoration of the second yahrzeit of Batsheva's father, of Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh of Philadelphia, who is on the 7th of which was on the 7th of Tammuz. He was a child survivor of Auschwitz and left over 100 descendants. The family should have an Nechama, the Neshama should have an Aliyah, and they should continue having Nachas from all of their children and grandchildren. We also thank our sponsors of Day of Learning. We thank Yosef Hashani Bezwadi for sponsoring all the Shurim of the day in commemoration of the 4th yahrzeit of Linda March. Chaya Gila Bas Yehudis and Neshama should have an Aliyah, and the family should have a Nechama. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Ben and Nechama Grossman. We sponsored Daf Yomi today in honor of the wedding of Jacob Applebaum to Amber Chazan. Mazel Tov. So today's daf is daf Chaf Beis. We're going to pick up 3 lines from the bottom on daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. The Gemara says as follows: Tanya, Shimon Elazar Omer Lo Yaskir Adam Sadeu Lekusi. Nikras al Shemo. A person cannot rent out his field to a kusi. Again, a kusi is somebody who we're going to consider him to be a semi-Jew. He's somebody who converted, but the conversions were quite questionable because they were circumstantial, and there's a lot of different opinions as to whether they actually kept up their Judaism, whether they went back to be serving Avoda Zara, what that means for their conversions. But ultimately, they were considered Jews to the point where they had to keep mitzvos. And here the Gemara tells us that a person cannot rent his field to the kusi, nikras al shemo, because it carries the name of the Jew with it. So let's just say Ruvain rents his field to the kusi, it's still going to be known as Ruvain's field. What's the problem? The problem is the kusi is going to do work on the field on Chol Hamoed. So we mentioned yesterday that certain things are going to be permissible on Chol Hamoed. However, this is Melechas Uman, it's in the Karka, it's not a Davar Avoda, and therefore it should not be done on Chol Hamoed, and therefore a person cannot rent it to a Kusi because he's going to do work on Chol Hamoed. Avol, the Gemara says, you specifically mentioned a Kusi, we did not mention Ovi Kachavim. The Tosfos actually deals with this, whether or not whether this is an inference that we should make from the Gemara, but ultimately the Gemara does make this. The Gemara explains that yes, Kusi is where the problem is. Of Ovid Kachavim, but in Akum, what will be the halacha? The Gemara says, shari be permissible to rent your field to an Akum. Why? The Amri Arisa Arisuse of it. They're going to remove the name of the Jew from it. In other words, it's true that a Jew's name does get attached to his field when he rents it out. However, not when there is a sharecropper. When the sharecropper is there, everyone says, you know why this guy's doing the work? He's not doing the work because the Jew actually appointed him to do it. Even though Reuven owns the field, no one's going to say that Reuven asked this guy to do work on the field on Chol Hamoed. The reason why the worker, this Akum, is doing work on the field on Chol Hamoed is because this Akum is interested in bringing home a share of the crop. And therefore, he's doing the work totally unbeknownst to the Jew and has nothing to do with Jew. The Gemara says, Yihachi Kusi Nami. When it comes to a Kusi, same thing will be true. Why are we saying that there's a problem with the Jew's name is going to be attached to this field? Nami Amri Arisa Arisusi Avid. People will say the reason why the Kusi is doing work on the field in Chol Hamoed is because he wants to get a share of the crop. It has nothing to do with the owner of the field. The Gemara says, Arisus Reb Shimon, top of Chaf Beis Amud Aleph, Arisus Reb Shimon ben Elazar Leslie. Shimon ben Elazar does not buy into this concept of Arisus. Now, exactly what that means is not 100% clear, but there's 2 ways of understanding it. Either that he says that the fact that there is an aris in the field doesn't help, or that people are not going to make that conclusion. In other words, I think the most logical way of understanding this is, Shimon Elazar is telling us that you are expecting people to see somebody working on a field on Chol HaMoed, knowing that the field belongs to a Jew, you're expecting them to understand that the person who's working there is working there because he's motivated by his own percentage of the field that he's going to get. Says Reb Shimon and Elazar, no, people are not going to make that conclusion. Rather, what are people going to say? The reason why this person is out in the field harvesting and doing all the work is because the Jew actually sent him there, and therefore, he says it's a problem to have a kusi do that. Gemara says, hold on. If Reb Shimon and Elazar does not buy into this concept of Aris Arisusa Ka'avid, that the sharecropper is working for his own motivation and not for the sake of the Jew, and he does not understand that that's going to be a heter, so then what's the differentiation between a kusi and Ovid Kechavim? We mentioned just a minute ago that this entire halach is only relevant if you're going to be leasing it to a kusi. However, when it comes to Ovid Kechavim, it's going to be permissible. If it's true that this heter of Aris Arisusa Ka'avid, in other words, that people will recognize he's working for his own self-motivation to get his own share of the field, so then why would he permit an akum to do it? That's why the Gemara says, El Ovid Kechavim, my time and mutter. Why is it permissible when it comes to an akum? The Gemara says something, a very important rule over here. You know why? The Amrinon lay, if you have an akum, a non-Jew, goes ahead and leases your field, the Amrinon lay v'tzayis. You tell him what the rules and regulations are, what are the terms of this agreement, he's going to listen. You'll rent it to him, you'll lease it to him, and say, listen, Mr. Non-Jew, the halacha is that on Shabbos, I'm not allowed to have people working on my field, and therefore don't show up on Shabbos. And the non-Jew is going to say, okay, I don't know much about Shabbos, I don't keep Shabbos, I don't think much about Shabbos, but I'm leasing this field from somebody who does keep Shabbos. These are the rules, and I'll follow the rules. However, the Gemara says, if that's the case, then why can't you do the same thing with the kusi? Kusi nami, I'm going to leave it tzayis. Lease the field to the kusi, and tell him, on Shabbos, you can't show up. The Gemara says, no, kusi lo tzayis. Kusi is not going to listen. You know why? The Amar is going to say, Ana gamirna tfei minach. I know just as much and a little bit more than you. I learned these halachas. I went to the Geira school, and I went to yeshiva afterwards, and I learned the halachas, and I know that I'm allowed to do this because I'm an aris. Now, what's the lesson from this? It's often very, very important. You hear this often when you have non-Jewish employees in Jewish institution saying, oh, this non-Jewish employee, he knows more Hilchas Shabbos than anybody else. He works in the kitchen, he knows Hilchas Kashrus. He knows everything. The Gemara is telling us that's not a good idea. You don't start telling people who don't have Yiras Shamayim, who don't really care about the halachas, you don't give them intricate explanations of halacha. We don't want the kusi, or for that matter, the non-Jew, to be so learned in halacha that when you tell them, the halacha is, you can't cook something in the kitchen because there's a problem called bishul akum, and therefore I'm the one who turns on the fire. You don't want to start giving all the halachas of bishul akum. It's only in something which is not nechal chai, it's only on davar roy lamed al shulchan malachim, there's different conditions. Once that happens, you start having the non-Jew start saying, you're telling me what the halach is in this kitchen? I've been working in this kitchen for 25 years. I know Hilchas Kashrus. Because once that starts happening, you start having a situation where he says, Ana gamirna tfei minach. I know more than you. Keep it simple. These are the rules. These are the terms of the lease. You should just know, you can't show up on Shabbos. Shabbos is a day off. You don't want him responding and saying, there's a concept called the daita denafshe ka'avid. I'm working for myself, not for you. Open up a Shulchan Aruch. You'll see that there are certain conditions. That's not a good idea. Because once that starts happening, then you have the concept of, Anag Gavir Natzei Minach, I know these halachas more than you. Keep it simple. These are the halachas. This is the rule. The conditions of the lease are, you don't show up on Shabbos. That's what the Gemara is telling us, that when it comes to an akum has no problem saying, listen, I'm doing business with a Jew, I got to follow all the regulations that come along with doing business with a Jew. But once you're dealing with somebody who's a quasi-Jew over here, then things get very complicated, and everyone thinks they know better than everybody else, and you end up having a problem. So that's why he differentiates between an akum and a kusi. You can lease your field to an akum because he'll listen. You can't lease your field to a kusi because he won't listen. The Gemara says, hold on a second. Why are we so concerned that the name of the Jew is going to be attached to this field, and people will suspect him of hiring the Jew to work for him on Shabbos? That sounds like just an issue of Maris Ayin, but not like really a problem over here. In other words, Maris Ayin is a problem, but not a real technical issue. Gemara says, why don't we say, you're going to lease this field to a Kusi. Again, a Kusi is a Jew, and he's not supposed to be working on the field. So why are you getting all bent out of shape that it's going to look poor, it's going to reflect poorly on the Jew? This is a much bigger problem. The Kusi himself is going to work on Shabbos, and it's going to be an issue of Lifnei Iver, replacing a stumbling block in front of him. The Gemara says, Chadav Od Kamar. You're right. It was saying one reason plus another reason. Chadav Mishum Lifnei Iver. It's true that there's a problem with Lifnei Iver. On top of that, on top of the fact that you are placing a stumbling block in front of this Kusi by having him work on Chol HaMoed, and on top of that, it's also going to reflect poorly on the owner of the field, because people are going to say, listen, field of Ruvain is being operated in a Chol HaMoed. Now the Gemara goes on to a case of partnership. We'll go through the Gemara, and perhaps we'll see this in Shulchan Aruch as well. I will tell you this is one of the more common issues that come up in business practices, where Jews and non-Jews have business practices together. There are many reasons why people do this, so we'll try to discuss it very briefly, how to go about structuring this in the proper way. But let's just first go to the Gemara. Hani Morikai. There are these Morikai. Now Morikai are, according to Rashi, Zorei Ginos Karkum. They plant fields of karkum. I'm not 100% sure karkum. I think it's turmeric. Is it turmeric? Saffron? Turmeric. It is turmeric? I think in Israel, when you buy karkum in the grocery store, it's turmeric. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. Okay, it was something that grew. Okay, you have these morikai, and you have a partnership between a Jew and a non-Jew who are working as sharecroppers. So you have this owner of a field, you have Ruvain, and let's just call him John, who were working together as sharecroppers on the field. And what they did was, to Oved Kuchavim, the Akum, Nokit B'Shabbata, he worked on Shabbos and took all of the produce from Shabbos. Yisrael B'Chad B'Shabbata, and the Yisrael, he worked on Sunday, because Yaakov didn't want to come in on Sunday, so he worked on Sunday and took all the produce from Sunday. So basically, they came up with a clever idea. I can't work on Shabbos, and I can't benefit from any work that's done on Shabbos, so Mr. Akum, you do the work on Shabbos. And I, says the Akum, can't come in on Sunday, so you, Mr. Jew, you do the work on Sunday, and you take all the benefits of Sunday. Now, technically, this should be a very good idea. And therefore, Asul Kamei de Rava, they came before Rava and they asked, Rava, is this okay? Shara lahu. And he said, yes, this is permissible, this is a good arrangement. Now the Gemara gives a little bit more context to what happened over here. Esvei Ravina la Rava. Ravina asked Rava, hold on a second, Rava, why did you permit this arrangement? We have a brayso here. It says, Yisrael v'ovid kechav m'shekivlu sad b'shutfis. Yisrael and an Akum who accept upon themselves to work on a field together as partnerships. Lo yomar Yisrael la'ovid kechavim. Yisrael cannot tell the Akum, Tal chel kechav Shabbos, you take your share on Shabbos, vani b'chol, and I'll do mine on Sunday. However, says that Mishnah, the imhisnu mitchila, if before they went into this partnership, they made this condition in advance, saying that I am going to own the responsibilities of Shabbos, you'll own the responsibilities of Sunday, and we're not going to share the profits for that. Vani b'chol, the mishnah mitchila mutter. Now, in Baal l'cheshbon, what if they did nothing? They didn't talk about it. It just happened to have been that they showed up. Akum showed up on Shabbos, and the Yisrael showed up on Sunday. And afterwards, they say, you know what? Let's divide it. I'll take Shabbos. You'll take Sunday. In such a case, Asr, it's going to be prohibited. Now we'll explain this in just a minute. But the bottom line is, the question on Rava is, Rava told this Akum and this Jew that it's permissible to do this. However, we see very clearly that this is only permissible if they make the condition in advance. In other words, just to see this halacha inside in Shulchan Aruch, this is in Siman Reish Mem Hey in Orach Chaim, and Shulchan Aruch writes the following: Yisrael ve'eni Yehudi sheyesh lem sada Otanor or Merchatz or Rechaim Shamayim B'Shutaf. A Yisrael and a non-Jew that have a business venture together. They own a store. If at the time they decided to become partners in this business, they made a condition, all profits of Shabbos belong to the Ein Yehudi. Makes no difference how much it is. Shabbos belongs to the non-Jew. The schar Yom Echad, and the schar, let's just call it Sunday, Keneged Yom Shabbos, the Yisrael Levado, is going to go to the Yisrael by himself. Halacha is mutter. It's permissible to do that. Vim lo hisnu b'tchila, if they did not make this condition in advance, then kishiyavo lachlok, when they come to split it, no to any Yehudi schar Shabbos kulam v'hashar chalkemoso. The Ein Yehudi takes all of Shabbos, and the rest is split. The Yisrael can't then take all the profits of Sunday. Rather, all of Sunday through Friday is going to be split, and Shabbos belongs to the Ein Yehudis. The Ein Yehudis is going to make more money. Now, if Imloha Yaschar Shabbos Yidu, if they don't know, then Yitol Ein Yehudi Levado Shvius Haschar V'Cholken Hashar. They'll take 1/7 and they split the rest. In other words, what's very important to understand over here is that if they don't make a condition in advance that the business belongs to the non-Jew on Shabbos and belongs to the Yisrael on Sunday, essentially, when the non-Jew shows up on Shabbos to do work, he's working as a shliach for the Yisrael. So this comes up very often in medical practices. This comes up in all types of service industries where they don't want to close on Shabbos for whatever reason it is. So the owner will take on a non-Jew and then say, you'll see all the patients on Shabbos, or you'll mow all the lawns, or do all the exterminating work on Shabbos, whatever it is that they do. And in such a case, it would technically be permissible only if the way that this is structured, and we actually have contracts that we do this with, where at the time that they go into a partnership, the partnership is drawn up that the business belongs to the non-Jew on Shabbos and all profits of Shabbos go to the non-Jew. The business belongs to the Yisrael on Sunday and all profits of Sunday go to the Yisrael. And then the rest of the week, they're partners. If they don't do that, then it's going to be a problem, because essentially when it comes to Shabbos, the non-Jew is working for the Jew on Shabbos, and number one, he violates the issue of Amir La'akum. He's asking a non-Jew to do work for him on Shabbos. Number two, there's a Schar Shabbos issue. He's making money on Shabbos. He's not allowed to benefit from that. So the only way to avert this is by creating this condition. What's the reason why the Gemara is bringing this in? The Gemara is bringing this in because Rava said it was permissible without making this condition. What happens? The Gemara says, Ichsif. Rava got embarrassed. He was embarrassed because he seemed to have passed wrong. L'sof, the Gemara says at the end, Igloi Milsa, it turned out that perhaps Rava didn't know this at the time that he answered the question, but Igloi Milsa, it turned out that the Hisnu Meikar, that they did indeed make this condition in advance. So you see this concept that this Siyata Deshmaya, that Rav has Siyata Deshmaya when he paskins the Shaila, that hopefully if he's paskening with Yer Shemayim, that even if he misses a detail, Hashem helps him out. In this case, you see Rava, he may have missed the detail, but it turns out that his psak was correct anyway. Now, now, Rav Gavia mi Bei Kassel, that was his name. His name was Rav Gavia, and he was from a place called Kassel. Amar, he said the story was different. Hanu Shasili de Arlahavi. This is not a Shabbos case. Rather, this was a case where they were working orchards, and we know the halach is for the first 3 years that a tree is planted, its fruits are so you're not allowed to benefit from them. Now, so what happened in this case was the non-Jew worked all those 3 years of Arla, and he benefited from it. He ate those fruits. The Yisrael showed up. Shani Da'ateri. He showed up in the 4th, 5th, and 6th years. Now, Aslu Kamei de Rava, they came before Rava, and they said, "Is this fine?" In other words, Ruvain says, "Listen, I've had John working on the field for years 1, 2, and 3. He did all the work necessary for the field, and he ate all the fruits. I'm here years 4, 5, and 6, and I'm going to eat the fruits because now it's not Arla anymore. And Sharlahu, he said it's fine. Now, the Gemara says, this doesn't make sense that this was the case, because V'ha'osve Ravina l'Rava. The Gemara says, Ravina asked a question to Rava. That question doesn't make any sense over here. Why not? Because when it comes to Shabbos, there's a problem of the Yisrael asking the non-Jew to do the work for him on Shabbos. But the prohibitions of Arla simply prohibit the consumption of the fruit. It doesn't say you're not allowed to work on the field. Of course you're allowed to work on the field. If you don't work in the field, everything's going to die. Everyone agrees you're allowed to work on the field during the years of Arla. So what was the problem that Ravina was asking Rava? The Gemara says, no, he didn't have any problem for Rava. Rather, l'sayue sayeh. He just wanted to actually back him up by saying, yes, there's this concept that when a Jew and a non-Jew go into business together, they can make this condition where you have the non-Jew working a period of time and reaping all those benefits, and the Jew working a period of time reaping those benefits, so it's not a problem. The Gemara says, hold on. Rava got embarrassed. Why did he get embarrassed if someone just came to give him a raya, a proof that he's correct? The Gemara says, Lo haya dvar me'olam. That's just a fabricated story. Rava never got embarrassed. That part of the story actually never happened. So according to Rav Gavia Mibei Kassel, the embarrassment part of the story never happened, and it actually lines up pretty well, because if he never got embarrassed, then he had nothing to worry about. He gave the right psak the whole time. Now the Gemara asks the question, what happens if they never spoke about it? Stama mai. They didn't talk about this condition at all. So the Gemara says, Tashamat, let's try to bring a raya. Im hisnu mitchila mutter. It says clearly that if they made this condition in advance, it's going to be permissible. What does that imply? The implication is hastama aser, that if they didn't discuss it, it's going to be prohibited. Gemara says, Ema Seifa, read the end of it. In Bo Lachashva, if they just showed up at the end to divide it, aser, it's going to be prohibited, because in such a case, they're ultimately appointing each other as a shliach. Hastama, what if they just came up, didn't even bother discussing it? That's just how they divided it. In other words, what happened? It just turns out that the Jew wasn't working on Shabbos, so he didn't show up. And the non-Jew wasn't working on Sunday, so he didn't show up. And then when it came to dividing it, they just divided it. So in such a case, it doesn't sound like they made a cheshbon at the end. They just worked out. After all this time together, it turns out the Jew doesn't work on Shabbos, the non-Jew doesn't work on Sunday. So it just turned out without discussing, that's what happened. It sounds like the only problem is if they came to make a cheshbon, came to calculate it and started discussing it. That's when it's a problem in hindsight. Marsa hastama, if it just happened that way, mutter. Ela mihal lekal mashma mina. From here we have no raya, and therefore we cannot prove the case from here. Hadron alach lefnei yadayim. This concludes the first parak of Maseches Avoda Zara. I'm just going to read for you quickly from the Mishnah Brura. Mishnah Brura in Siman Reish Mem Hey writes the following at the beginning. He says, "Da, you should just know this is Reish Mem Hey, Sif Aleph, Sif Katan Aleph in the Mishnah Brura. You should know haheter gamor hu. The absolute heter for this partnership is Bim ha-Yisrael yeshlo eza asik. If a Jew has a business, o malacha, or any kind of work, b'shutafos im ha'eni Yehudi, partnership with a non-Jew, what's the halacha? Sheyasnu mitchila kodem shelokhe b'shutfis. Before they go into a partnership, you make this condition: Avod ata b'Shabbos. You non-Jew work for me on You non-Jew work on Shabbos. The tikach kefi malachtecha. Whatever profits are earned on Shabbos belong to you. Hein rav, hein ma'ah. Does not make a difference how much it is. Va'ani, I, evod kenegdecha yom echad b'chol. I'm going to work one day during the week that you don't have to work. The etal kefi malachti, and I will take the profits of that day. Now, b'shasa chaluka, at the time that they're dividing the profits, yitol ha'eni Yehudi schar avor Shabbos. The Ein Yehudi takes whatever he earned. Yisrael Yital Yom Echad Kenegdo, one day that he worked. Hein Rav, Hein Ma'at makes no difference how much it is. You have to always calculate accurately. Aval im Lois Numitchila, they did not make this condition at the beginning. Ubeshas Chaluka Amrli Ein Yehudi Ata Keneged Amalcha B'Shavos Ani B'Chol Zevadei Aser. They did not make this condition. And afterwards, they started discussing and dividing it. It's going to be a problem because they're essentially working for each other. Now, says the Mishnah Brura, what if they did not make this condition in the beginning? When it came time at the end for the division, they just divided everything equally. Exactly our Gemara's question, which is stam. They did not make the condition, but it came to dividing the profits, they simply did it What's the halacha? Zebayo begamar v'lo ifshata. The Mishnah Berurah says this is a question in the Gemara that was not answered. Newsflash, that's today's Gemara. The pasuk harambam l'chumra. The Rambam was machmir that no, you can't just divide it evenly. V'harash l'kula. Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh paskin leniently that yes, they could just divide it equally. And the mechaber, the Sfardim follow sasam ka Rambam. He passes like the Rambam that no, you can't just divide it evenly. V'harama. The Rama pasak b'hagah karosh b'mokum hefsed gadol. The Rama Ashkenazim follow paskin like the Rosh b'mokum hefsed gadol. It's clearly in the Rama writes it over here very clearly. The v'yesh batir naschar bet yevim lehisnu v'chalka b'stam. The near leads b'hefsed gadol yeshmus lismo chalayu. You could rely on that. Anyway, that's the basic halacha, and it's important to note that the Chaver says the following: what if initially they made these conditions, and then achar kach b'shas chalukah at the time of division nisratza ha'en Yehudi lachlok b'shava. The non-Jew says, you know what, these calculations, they're killing me. They're wasting my time. I'm a doctor. I'm a dentist. I'm an exterminator. I'm a gardener. I can't sit here making all these calculations, spreadsheets, and all this stuff. Let's just divide the profits equally. What's the halacha? It's mutter. Why? Because essentially then, he's just giving a gift. And the Mishnah Berurah writes, Ela matana ba'almahu diyav le'en Yehudi kivin tehisnu mitchila sheyiyah yom Shabbos shayach lo levato. In other words, if the Ein Yehudi wants to do that, he's able to do that. Then obviously, you can't expect him to do that because the money from Shabbos belongs to him. These are actually quite common, these questions that come up. In general, my advice to people is if you're able to avoid this, avoid it. If you own a business, your business should be closed on Shabbos. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what happens when you have a business that's open on Shabbos. It's understandable some businesses can't close on Shabbos. Medical practices, certain things just can't close on Shabbos because of emergencies and expectations that they have to be open. But if you have a business that can be closed on Shabbos, that's the right thing to do. It gets very complicated, and the Yetzer Hara sometimes to do things that you shouldn't be doing gets very strong when there's a business that's facing significant financial losses once it's open on Shabbos. So my recommendation is if you have the ability to close your business on Shabbos and on Yom Tov and on Chol Hamoed, do it. If you can't, so then we start figuring out exactly how to structure these contracts. Let's go on to the next parak of Ein Ma'amidin. Ein Ma'amidin behema b'pundakais sh'ovdi gechav. We learned this before. And here the Mishnah tells us, person's not allowed to deposit his animal in I'm not sure if it's called a kennel, like kennels are for dogs probably, but it's essentially the same thing, a babysitting group for an animal. You can't leave your animal in the hands of an akum. Why? Akum, they are suspect for bestiality, and it is prohibited even for an akum, for a ben Noach to do that. Rashi tells us over here, Pasuk tells us when it comes to intimacy, they should become basar echad, which means that the male and the female, they join together and they have the ability to produce a child. However, that's only true when it comes to humans, but not when it comes to animals. Giving an animal to an akum, where he is chashad on bestiality, it is placing a stumbling block in front of him, therefore you can't do it. Lotus yachid isha imahem, a woman cannot seclude herself with an akum, because they are suspect for immoral behavior. Now, it's important to know that a woman is not allowed to seclude herself with a Jew either. There's an Isser of Yichud. The Gemara is going to deal with this on Daf Chaf Hey. The Gemara is going to ultimately explain this is talking about a case where it would be permissible for a Jew. For example, if the man is there and his wife is with him, so his wife is ultimately a protection. So when it comes to a Jew, then she's allowed to be there because the man is there and his wife is in the area. However, when it comes to an akum, that's not going to help. Lo yisyachid adam imam, any person cannot be left in seclusion with an akum. Ovdei kochavim are suspect for shvichas damim, and we are concerned the person will lose their life. Now, so then, if the Gemara is also going to ask, hold on a second. prohibited for anybody to be secluded with an akum, so why do you have to have a line that says it's prohibited for a woman to be secluded because of Aryeh? What about her life? I think Gemara is going to ask this question. The Gemara is ultimately going to answer that it's talking about a case where the akum is not going to kill this particular woman. However, when it comes to Aryeh, that is something that we're still suspect for. Gemara says, "V'raminu, we have a stira." It says clearly, "Lokchen mehen behema lekarbon." You're allowed to buy an animal from this akum for a carbon. Ve'ein chosheshin lo mishum roveya. We don't suspect that maybe the akum used the animal for this inappropriate type of relationship over here. V'lo mishum nirva. We don't suspect that it. In other words, it's both ways of bestiality. V'lo mishum nirva. V'lo mishum mukta. We don't assume that he set it aside for Avoda Zara. This is not Muktzah of Shabbos. Muktzah means set aside for Avoda Zara. We're not worried that he used this animal for Avoda Zara purposes. Now the Gemara says, I can understand why we're not worried about Muktzah v'nevad. B'shlama Muktzah v'nevad. I can understand why he's not going to, we don't think that he set aside this animal or served this animal for Avoda Zara. Because im isa de akse, if it would be true, they set this aside for Avodah Zara, or im isa de palche. It's true that he bowed down to this animal. Lo haya mazben le. You don't sell your Avodah Zara. It's just not respectful to sell your Avodah Zara on the market. El rovea v'nirva. But the fact that maybe he used this animal for bestiality purposes, lachosh. Maybe he used it. Why are you allowed to buy it for a carbon? In other words, you just told me an akum is suspect on these types of behaviors. So why are you allowed to buy an animal from him and use it for a carbon? If an animal was used for such a purpose, it is disqualified from carbon use. Amar of Tachlifa, Amar of Shila, Baravina Mishmei Derav, Ovid Kechav Mchasa Behemto Shlo Te'akar. If it's his own animal, he's not going to do that. You know why? Because if he will do that to a female animal, it's going to cause infertility with the animal. He does not want that to happen. He wants the animal to be able to continue to give birth. So the monetary value of the animal being able to give birth is worth more than his desires in this case, or maybe some type of Avodah Zara ideals of having this relationship with the animal. He's not going to do that. It's going to ruin it. That makes sense when it comes to the females. He doesn't want to do it to the nekeva because then it's not going to be able to give birth. Zachar Michael Meimar. But what stops him from doing this to a zachar? The Gemara says, of kahana hayul umakhishin bebasar. It does cause some type of weakening of the flesh of the animal if he does it, and therefore he does not want to ruin the quality of the animal. So when it comes to his own animals, the Gemara is essentially finishing off by saying, when it comes to his own animals, he's not going to do that because it causes a loss. However, when it comes to the animal of a Jew, the animal deposited his animal in the care of this akum, in such a case, he's not so concerned about the quality of the animal, and his desires for these things is going to be stronger. Elha Tanya, the Gemara says, well, let's check out this price. It says, Lokchin behema miroa shalahem. You're allowed to buy an animal from their shepherds. Now hold on a second. Shepherd doesn't own the animal. He doesn't care about the value of the animal. Why? If you're telling me that this is true, that an akum has this predisposition to engage in these kinds of disgusting behaviors, so then why are you allowed to buy it from a shepherd? The shepherd doesn't own the animal. He doesn't have an investment in the actual animal. Leichush dilma roa shalahan. So leichush dilma roa shalahan. Maybe the shepherd actually did these unbecoming behaviors with the animal. Mara says, no, misyari mishum hefset schar. Since we mentioned that it ruins the animal, he's worried that he's going to get busted, and then the owner of the animal is going to say, Mr. Shepherd, did you do this with the animal? He's going to say, yes, I'm sorry. And he's going to say, you know what, I'm not paying you. Or you know what, you have to reimburse me for the value of the animal that you ruined. The Gemara says, Tanya, let's look at what it says in the Brisa. Ein moshin behema l'roa shalahan. It says you can't give your animals to their shepherds. Now, if you're telling me that the shepherd is indeed scared that he's going to get caught, so then why is it forbidden for us to give our animals to the shepherd? Why don't we just say, Gemara says something very important. Inhu di yadi bahadadi mirtasi. Since this was commonplace among these Ovdei Kochavim to do these behaviors, so they know that these behaviors are things that come up, and it's something they look out for. So when the akum goes to his shepherd, he's going to say, what did you do today with the animal? Did you do any of that kind of stuff? He's going to be uncomfortable. He's going to be scared he'll get caught. But when it comes to the animal of a Jew, he's going to say, Jews don't do these kinds of things. It's ridiculous. It won't even enter his mind that I did something like this. So you know what? I'll do it. And the Jew's never going to suspect me of doing it. So therefore, the Gemara says, but we're not part of this culture. Lo mirtasi, they're not worried that they'll get caught. This is what the expression means. When it comes to the michtava is like an iron writing tool that was used to etch out into marble. And it means that the marble is scared of the writing tool. And when it comes to a gossiper, his friend knows about it. In other words, the idea over here is that when you know something, when different gossipers know each other, so then if I'm a gossiper and you're a gossiper, I won't want to tell you anything because I'll be suspect that you'll tell everybody everything because I'm part of that culture. We're constantly yapping about everybody. So therefore, I'm worried about it. However, when it comes to people who are not part of the culture, you're not so worried about it. It's just not something which constantly is on your mind. Which, to a certain extent, it's true. There's a certain vulnerability with innocence. That when people are so innocent, they just don't realize that they could sometimes find themselves to be subject to something which is just not part of their culture. So there's this balance. You have to make sure people are educated and know what goes on in the world. But at the same time, you don't want to pollute people's minds with nonsense. So this is what the Gemara means. In that culture where it was normal to do these things, so what happened was there wasn't such a vulnerability because people openly talked about it and said, listen, there's this concept. Baruch Hashem, it's not really so relevant. Tosfos actually brings this down on Daf Beis and Aleph. He says, nowadays, we do give our animals to these people. And Tosfos essentially says it's something which it's not part of the culture anymore. We're not worried about that. So again, I don't know all the history of this, but apparently this was part of the culture. The Gemara says that Bilam had this kind of relationship with his animal. This week's parsha, right? It says he had this very close relationship with his donkey. We'll refer to it as that just for the sake of this. The bottom line is. Bilam had this relationship, so it was part of this culture. And again, we don't know this culture, thank goodness, but ultimately it did exist. Yes, so the Gemara says, if that's true, so then Zacharim minakevos lo nizbon. We should not be able to buy male animals like for Ola from a female. Why? Because nothing will happen. In other words, we mentioned that when the animal is going to be used for these purposes, so either it will cause it to be sterile or it's going to cause it to become weak. However, when it comes to a female can't accomplish that, so therefore we should be worried that maybe she used the male animal for her own purposes. Chashin Dilma Marvalei. Maybe she used the male animals to come on her. Gemara says no. Kivan the migri ba mirtasa. Once the animal has this relationship with her, it's going to develop a very close relationship with her, and it's constantly going to be following her around. So she's worried. She doesn't want people to say, "Miss, why is this animal clinging to you so much?" She's going to have to say, "Well, something happened." So therefore, she's not going to do it. Lahadatani Rabbi Yosef Armalta lo tarvium kalba. A single woman should not be left with the dog. Lo tishri bar beirav vushbiza. She shouldn't have a yeshiva student staying in her house. Now Bishlam bar beirav can understand why you shouldn't have the single student in her house because tzniala, he's going to be too embarrassed to tell anybody what happened. So if there's an inappropriate relationship, no one will find out about it. The dog's going to follow her, so she'll be scared to do this kind of thing with a dog. So why is it prohibited to leave it there? Where it says, "Kivin de kichishadya lo umtzu umasru chabasra meimer amar inish to hide the masru chabasra mishum umtzu de kamasru." In other words, Gemara is going to say there are many reasons why dogs follow people. They follow people because you feed them. Every time you feed the dog, it develops a relationship with you. So the dog, you come home, the dog gets excited because it knows it's getting lunch. So in other words, people are not going to say, if the dog starts barking when you come home, oh, it's because an inappropriate relationship took place. You're going to say, you know why it's excited and wagging its tail? Because it's expecting a little piece of meat. Gemara says, "Nekavis says nekavis my time." So what is the problem? Nekavis says nekavis my time lo miachtin. What's the problem of having females together with females? You're right, between females and female animals there's nothing to worry about. However, the problem is when it comes to the akum, they are mitzuyin eitzel neshei chavreim. They're hanging out with their friends' wives all the time. Might come over one day to find her, and she's not there. What happens? Umotzatz behema. He finds the behema verova. He's going to have this intimate relationship. Now, the Vibai Sema, others say, afilu motza, even if she is home, it's still going to be a problem. Why? Nami rova. He's still going to have this relationship with the animal. The mar said chaviva aleim behemten shal Yisrael. These akum, they have this real love for the animals of Jews. Yos minashoseim, more than their wives. Tosfos says, just know where he got this from. If you look at Tosfos, Damar Chaviva Leim B'Heptashay Yisrael Lo Noda Lari Mehecha Nafka Ikar Davar Zeh. He doesn't know where this comes from, but he knew this. I don't know. Damar Rabbi Yochanan Disha Sheba Nachash Achava. At the time that the Nachash, we always hear about the snake, the serpent, and its relationship with Chava, how it seduced her to eat from the Eitzadas. But we also are taught that the Nachash, it used to be a standing creature. It also had an intimate relationship with Chava. At that point in time, Hitel ba Zuama. They placed an impurity inside her, and therefore they got so corrupted and polluted that they did these terrible things. Gemara says, hold on a second. Chava, she is the the mother of all people. Yach Yisrael Nami. Jews should have the same predisposition. Gemara says, Yisrael Sh'amdu al Har Sinai Paska Zuamasa. When the Yidden stood at Har Sinai, accepted the Torah, Kadosh Baruch Hu cleaned them up, took away all that tumah, that impurity. Of the Kechavim Sh'amdu Har Sinai, Paska Zuamasa, of the Kechavim didn't have that opportunity, and therefore they still remain with that impurity. Because we have another minute. What about birds? Are we worried about leaving birds in the hands of Odei Kechavim? Gemara says, Tashim try to bring a riot. Rav Huda, Shmuel, Mishum, Rabbi, Chanina, name of Rabbi Chanina, Ani Reisi. I saw over Kechavim Shlakach Avas Minashuk. He bought a goose in the market. Rava, he did the deed. Chanka, he choked it. Salah, and he roasted it. So yeah, there's a problem. V'achla, and then he ate it. So you see, there's a problem even when it comes to a bird. Amr Yirmim B'Difti, even worse, Yirmim B'Difti said, Anira Isi, Arvi Achar, I saw this Arab, Shalakach, Yarach ben Ashok, he bought a piece of meat in the marketplace, and he had some crazy fetish to go do this crazy thing with a piece of meat. He cut up a hole in it. Rava, he had this relationship with it. Salava Achla. So you know what? Don't leave anything, even birds, in the hands of an akum, because one never knows what they're going to do. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
About working with Williams.